I thought the hardest part was identifying his body at the morgue. I was wrong. The hardest part was finding the spare key to another woman's car in his jacket pocket, and realizing my entire marriage had been built on a foundation of lies I never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rachel Martinez, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought I knew everything about my husband of 12 years. I believed David was the devoted father to our twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, the reliable insurance adjuster who worked late because he cared about his clients, and the man who still brought me coffee in bed every Sunday morning just the way I liked it. I was a high school English teacher in Millbrook Falls, Connecticut, living what I thought was an ordinary, happy life in our blue colonial house on Maple Street. That Tuesday morning started like any other. David kissed me goodbye at 6:30, told me he had a long day ahead with back-to-back claim inspections, and promised to pick up Emma from soccer practice since I had parent conferences until 7. He smelled like the cologne I bought him for Christmas, his tie was perfectly straight, and he even remembered to grab the travel mug I had filled with his favorite dark roast. For 12 years, this had been our routine. For 12 years, I never questioned where he really went during those long days. The call came at 2:15 in the afternoon. I was in the middle of teaching my sophomore literature class about dramatic irony in Romeo and Juliet, when Principal Harrison knocked on my classroom door. His face was pale, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something I had never seen before. He asked to speak with me privately, and I knew immediately that something terrible had happened. You know how they say your blood runs cold? That actually happens. I felt it, that icy sensation spreading through my veins as I followed him into the hallway. The words seemed to float around me without landing. Highway accident, 18-wheeler. No survivors. David's silver Honda Accord had been completely destroyed when a truck driver fell asleep at the wheel on Interstate 84, just outside of Hartford. The police officer who called said it happened instantly, that David wouldn't have felt any pain. I remember thinking how strange it was that this stranger was trying to comfort me about my husband's final moments, as if knowing he didn't suffer would somehow make the gaping hole in my chest hurt less. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, casseroles from neighbors, and the exhausting task of explaining to my 8-year-old daughters why Daddy wasn't coming home anymore. Emma took it stoically, asking practical questions about where Daddy's body was, and whether he could still hear us when we talked to him. Sophie, always the more emotional twin, refused to believe he was really gone, and kept asking when he would be back from his work trip. I held them both while they cried, while I cried, while our whole world fell apart in that living room where David used to read them bedtime stories and help them with their math homework. The insurance money came through quickly. David had always been thorough about that sort of thing, and his own company processed the claim with unusual efficiency. $200,000 for accidental death, plus another $100,000 from a policy I didn't even know he had taken out. When I mentioned the second policy to his supervisor, Tom Bradley, he looked confused and said he wasn't aware David had purchased additional coverage. At the time, I just assumed it was something David had arranged privately to make sure we were taken care of. He had always been the responsible one, the planner, the one who thought 3 steps ahead. The funeral was held at St. Michael's Catholic Church, where we had been married, and where the girls had been baptized. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The entire congregation of teachers from Roosevelt High School came to pay their respects, along with David's co-workers and what felt like half the town. Father McKenna spoke about David's dedication to his family and his generous spirit. Tom Bradley gave a eulogy about David's integrity and work ethic. I sat in the front pew with Emma and Sophie on either side of me, accepting condolences from people who kept telling me what a wonderful man my husband had been, how lucky I was to have had 12 beautiful years with him. But it was the woman in the black dress who caught my attention. She sat in the very back of the church, arrived late, and left before the processional even began. I only noticed her because she was crying harder than anyone else in that room, her shoulders shaking with a grief that seemed too deep for a casual acquaintance. When I turned to get a better look at her, she was gone. I asked Tom if he knew who she was, but he said he hadn't noticed anyone matching that description. For some reason, that bothered me more than it should have. 2 weeks after the funeral, I finally gathered the courage to go through David's personal effects. The police had returned his wallet, his watch, and the clothes he was wearing, all carefully packaged in clear plastic bags with official labels. His jacket still smelled like him, a mixture of that Christmas cologne and something else I couldn't quite place. That's when I found the key. It was tucked into the inside pocket of his blazer, attached to a small purple keychain with the letter A engraved in silver script. I had never seen this key before. David drove a Honda, and this was clearly a Toyota key. The keychain was definitely not something I had given him, and it was far too feminine to be something he would have chosen for himself. I turned it over in my hands, studying the tiny scratches and wear marks that suggested it had been used frequently. The purple leather was soft and well worn, as if someone had carried it for a long time. That night, after I put the girls to bed, I sat at our kitchen table staring at that key and trying to make sense of it. David had never mentioned having access to another car. He had never mentioned knowing anyone with a Toyota. He had never mentioned anything about a purple keychain or anyone whose name started with A, except for his elderly Aunt Agnes, who lived in a nursing home in Florida and hadn't driven in years. I called Tom Bradley the next morning and asked if David had ever mentioned using a company car or having access to a vehicle other than his own. Tom said absolutely not, that adjusters always use their personal vehicles and were reimbursed for mileage. He also mentioned that David's Honda had been the only vehicle registered under his insurance policy with the company. When I pressed him about whether David might have been working with a partner or using a rental car for certain claims, Tom assured me that David always worked alone and that there were no records of him renting vehicles through the company. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in our empty bed, staring at the ceiling and turning that key over and over in my mind. Where had David gotten it? Why was he carrying it? Who was A, and what did this person mean to my husband? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, growing and spreading until they consumed every quiet moment I had. 3 weeks after David's death, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find the car that belonged to this key. I was going to find out who A was. And I was going to get the answers that David could no longer give me. I started with the most logical approach. Toyota dealerships within a 50-mile radius of Millbrook Falls. I drove to 6 different locations over 2 days, telling each service manager that I had inherited a car from a deceased relative but had no paperwork, only the key. I asked if they could help me identify the vehicle if I brought the key in. 4 of them said it would be impossible without additional information. 2 said they might be able to help if I knew the approximate year and model. That's when I remembered David's insurance files. He kept meticulous records of every claim he had ever handled, organized by date and stored in filing cabinets in our basement office. If he had been involved with another car, if he had been investigating an accident or processing a claim that involved a Toyota, there might be some record of it in his professional files. I spent an entire Saturday going through 3 years' worth of claim folders, property damage reports, medical summaries, witness statements, photographs of twisted metal and shattered glass. David's handwriting filled the margins of dozens of documents, his careful notes about damage assessments and liability determinations. But nowhere did I find any mention of a Toyota that might explain the key in his pocket. It was while I was putting the files back that I noticed something odd. There were gaps in the chronology. Weeks where David had filed no reports, claimed no cases, documented no work activities. When I cross-referenced these gaps with my own calendar, I realized they corresponded to times when David had told me he was working on particularly complex cases that required extensive travel or research. The first gap was 3 months long, from January to March of the previous year. David had told me he was handling a complicated fraud case that required him to interview witnesses across 3 states. He had been away from home at least 2 nights a week during that period, staying in hotels and calling me each evening to say goodnight to the girls. But according to his professional files, he had processed no interstate cases during that time. No fraud investigations. No travel vouchers. No hotel receipts in our joint credit card statements. The second gap was even longer. 6 months, from June to December. David had explained this period as his involvement in a class action lawsuit against a trucking company, requiring him to review thousands of documents and coordinate with attorneys in multiple jurisdictions. He had even shown me newspaper articles about the lawsuit, printed from the internet, and highlighted to show his company's involvement. But when I looked up the case online, I found no mention of David's insurance company as a party to the litigation. I realized I was holding that purple keychain so tightly that the metal edges were cutting into my palm. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my heart pounding in a way that reminded me of the panic attacks I used to have in college during finals week. Everything I thought I knew about the last year of my marriage was apparently wrong. David hadn't been working late, he hadn't been traveling for complex cases. He had been lying to me for months, maybe longer, and I had believed every word. The woman in the black dress at the funeral suddenly made perfect sense. She wasn't a coworker or a client or a distant friend. She was someone much more significant. Someone who had every reason to grieve my husband's death as deeply as I did. Maybe deeper. I needed to find that Toyota. I needed to find out who A was. And I needed to understand how completely I had been deceived by the man I thought I knew better than anyone in the world. I decided to approach this methodically, the way I taught my students to analyze literature. Look for patterns, examine inconsistencies, follow the evidence wherever it leads. The key was my starting point, but I needed more information before I could make sense of what David had been hiding from me. Monday morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. The substitute teacher coordinator, Mrs. Peterson, expressed her sympathies and told me to take all the time I needed. I felt guilty lying about being ill, but I couldn't explain that I was actually conducting an investigation into my dead husband's secret life. Instead, I dropped Emma and Sophie off at my mother's house, telling her I had some insurance paperwork to sort through and needed a quiet day to focus. My first stop was David's office at Hartley Insurance Group. Tom Bradley had mentioned that I could come by any time to collect David's personal items from his desk. I had been putting off this visit because I wasn't ready to see the space where David had spent so many hours, but now I had a different motivation. I needed to see if there were any clues in his professional environment that might explain the gaps in his case files. The Hartley building was a modest 2-story structure on Commerce Street, wedged between a dental office and a tax preparation service. David had worked there for 8 years, ever since we moved to Millbrook Falls when I got the teaching job at Roosevelt High. He always spoke fondly of his colleagues and seemed genuinely happy with his work. Tom Bradley greeted me in the lobby with a warm hug and genuine sympathy in his eyes. David's desk was exactly as he had left it, a coffee mug with a photo of the girls at last year's school carnival. A small American flag from Veterans Day, even though David had never served in the military. A stack of claim forms paperclipped together and marked with his careful handwriting. Everything looked normal, professional. Exactly what I would expect from the methodical man I had married. But as Tom showed me through David's filing system, I noticed something strange. The physical files in David's office only went back 18 months. When I asked about older cases, Tom explained that the company had digitized their records, and older files were stored electronically. He offered to show me how to access David's computer account so I could review his complete work history if needed for insurance or tax purposes. The digital files told a different story than what I had found in our basement. David's computer showed a complete record of cases, including the periods that had appeared as gaps in his home filing system. During the 3-month period when I thought he was traveling for a fraud investigation, his computer showed routine local claims, fender benders, minor property damage, a few medical consultations. Nothing that would require overnight travel or extended research. Even more puzzling, the cases logged in his computer during this period had all been closed successfully, with detailed reports and client signatures. If David had been working these local cases, why were there no corresponding files in our home office? Why had he told me he was working on something completely different? And why had he been away from home so frequently, if his actual work was all within a 30-mile radius of our house? Tom noticed my confusion and asked if everything was all right. I showed him the gap in David's home records and asked if it was normal for adjusters to keep incomplete files at home. Tom looked genuinely puzzled and said that most adjusters, including David, typically kept copies of all their cases for personal reference and continuing education purposes. He had never known David to be inconsistent about his record-keeping. I asked Tom if he could think of any reason David might have been away from home during periods when his computer showed only local work. Tom frowned and said that David had always been one of their most reliable adjusters, never missing appointments and always available during business hours. In fact, Tom couldn't recall David ever requesting time off for extended travel or special projects. According to Tom's memory, David had been present in the office every day during the periods I was asking about. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. Either Tom was lying, which seemed unlikely given his genuine confusion, or David had been maintaining two completely separate versions of his professional life. One version for his colleagues and one version for me. The question was why he would go to such elaborate lengths to deceive everyone around him. I thanked Tom for his time and loaded David's personal items into my car. The drive home took me past the intersection where David's accident had occurred. I had been avoiding this route for weeks, but today I found myself pulling over and staring at the stretch of highway where my husband had died. There were still skid marks on the asphalt, and a small memorial of flowers that someone had left near the guardrail. Standing there in the late afternoon sun, I tried to piece together the timeline of David's final day. According to the police report, the accident happened at 1:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. David had left home that morning saying he had back-to-back claim inspections, but his computer at work showed no appointments scheduled for that day. His supervisor had no record of him being assigned to any specific cases. So, where had David been going when the truck driver fell asleep and crossed the median? The police report included the responding officer's contact information. Officer Maria Santos had been first on the scene and had handled the initial investigation. I called the number listed and was surprised when she answered on the second ring. Officer Santos remembered the case clearly and agreed to meet with me at the police station the following morning. She said that family members often had questions that weren't fully addressed in the formal reports, and she was happy to provide additional details if it would help me find closure. That evening, after I put the girls to bed, I spread David's personal effects across our dining room table and examined each item carefully. His wallet contained the usual things: driver's license, credit cards, insurance cards, $43 in cash, and a folded receipt from Murphy's gas station dated the morning of his death. The timestamp showed 8:15 a.m., which made sense since David typically stopped for coffee and gas on his way out of town. But Murphy's gas station was 15 miles north of Millbrook Falls, in the opposite direction from David's office and from any of the claim locations he had been working recently. Why would David drive 15 miles out of his way for gas when there were 3 stations closer to home and 4 more between our house and his office? I called Murphy's and spoke to the day manager, a friendly man named Pete, who said he would check their security footage from that date if I wanted to come by tomorrow. David's watch was a simple Seiko that I had given him for our 5th anniversary. The crystal was cracked from the impact, and the hands had stopped at 1:52 p.m., 5 minutes after the official time of the accident. But when I looked closely at the date function, I noticed something odd. The watch showed Tuesday the 15th, but David had died on Tuesday the 22nd. Either the watch had been running a week slow, which seemed unlikely for a reliable timepiece, or David had been wearing a watch that wasn't keeping accurate time. I checked our joint calendar to see if there was any significance to the 15th. That was the day David had told me he would be in Springfield, reviewing files for a workers' compensation case. I had marked it on the calendar because it was also the day of Emma's parent-teacher conference, which David had missed because of his work commitment. But according to his computer records, David had worked 3 local cases that day and had been back in the office by 4 p.m. Another discrepancy that made no sense. The purple keychain seemed to mock me from where I had placed it next to David's other belongings. The letter A was intricately engraved in a script font that looked expensive, personalized. I had been assuming A was a woman's initial, but now I wondered if it might represent something else. A place, maybe, or a business name. Or perhaps it wasn't the person's first name but their last name or nickname. I spent an hour on Google searching for Toyota dealerships, repair shops, rental agencies, and any other automotive businesses in Connecticut that started with A. I found dozens of possibilities. Anderson Toyota in Waterbury, Advanced Auto Repair in New Haven, Allstate Car Rental in Hartford. I made a list of phone numbers and addresses, planning to call each one the next day to ask if they recognized David's name or had any record of issuing a key to him. Sleep was impossible again that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to construct scenarios that would explain all the inconsistencies I had discovered. Maybe David had been working a secret case for the insurance company, something that required him to maintain a cover story for security reasons. Maybe he had been helping a friend or relative who was in some kind of trouble and needed David's professional expertise. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation for everything, and I was letting grief and paranoia turn normal circumstances into something sinister. But even as I tried to convince myself that there were logical explanations, I couldn't shake the feeling that David had been living a double life. The missing files, the conflicting work schedules, the mysterious key, the woman at the funeral who cried like she had lost someone irreplaceable. All of these pieces pointed to a conclusion I wasn't ready to accept. My husband had been involved with another woman and he had been lying to me about it for months. The next morning, I drove to Murphy's gas station before my appointment with Officer Santos. Pete, the day manager, was a heavy-set man in his 50s who remembered David immediately when I showed him the receipt. David had been a regular customer for about 6 months, always stopping on Tuesday mornings around 8:15, always buying premium gas and a large coffee with cream and sugar. Pete said David was friendly and polite, usually chatting about the weather or asking about Pete's grandchildren. What struck me was Pete's certainty about the day of the week. Tuesday mornings, always Tuesday mornings. I asked Pete if he was sure about this pattern, and he nodded emphatically. David had become such a regular that Pete had started having his coffee ready by 8:20, knowing David would be arriving soon. Pete had actually noticed when David didn't show up the week after the accident, and that's when he had heard about the collision from other customers. This established that David had been making regular trips north of town every Tuesday for 6 months. Since Pete remembered David's final visit clearly, that meant David had been following this pattern for approximately 26 weeks before his death. 26 Tuesdays when David had told me he was going to work, but had actually been driving in the opposite direction to destinations unknown. Officer Santos was waiting for me when I arrived at the police station. She was a compact woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes, who spoke with the careful precision of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news to grieving families. She led me to a small conference room and spread the accident file across the table, explaining each document as we reviewed it together. The collision had been straightforward from an investigative standpoint. The truck driver had fallen asleep after working a double shift and had drifted across the median into oncoming traffic. David had no time to react and no opportunity to avoid the impact. The truck driver survived with minor injuries and was later charged with vehicular manslaughter. Officer Santos assured me that David's death had been instantaneous and that he had done nothing wrong. But when I asked about David's destination that day, Officer Santos admitted that this had been one of the unresolved questions in her report. David's car had been traveling north on Interstate 84, but his insurance company had no record of him being assigned to any cases in that direction. His GPS system had been destroyed in the crash, so there was no way to determine where he had been planning to go. Officer Santos had noted this discrepancy in her report, but had not pursued it further, since it didn't affect the determination of fault in the accident. I showed Officer Santos the receipt from Murphy's gas station and explained the pattern Pete had described. Officer Santos was immediately interested and asked if I had discovered any other evidence that David had been making regular trips to unknown destinations. When I mentioned the gaps in his case files and the conflicting work schedules, she suggested that I might want to consider filing a report with the Insurance Fraud Investigation Unit. According to Officer Santos, it wasn't uncommon for insurance adjusters to become involved in fraudulent schemes, either as victims or as participants. The fact that David had been secretive about his activities and had been carrying an unexplained car key suggested that he might have been investigating something unofficial or had become entangled in something he couldn't discuss with his employer or family. Officer Santos gave me the contact information for Detective Raymond Walsh, who specialized in insurance fraud cases. I left the police station with more questions than answers, but also with a growing sense that I was finally on the right track. David hadn't been having an affair in the traditional sense. He had been involved in something more complex, something that required him to maintain elaborate deceptions and follow regular patterns that he couldn't explain to anyone around him. The drive home took me past the Toyota dealership where I had struck out the week before. On impulse, I pulled into the parking lot and walked into the service department. This time, instead of asking about identifying a car from a key, I had a different approach. I showed the service manager David's photo and asked if he looked familiar. Did he recognize this man as someone who had brought in a vehicle for service or maintenance? The service manager, whose name tag read Gary, studied David's photo carefully. After a moment, he nodded and said that David looked familiar, but he couldn't place him exactly. Gary called over 2 of his technicians and showed them the photo. The younger technician, Carlos, immediately recognized David and said he had brought in a silver Toyota Camry several times over the past few months for routine maintenance and oil changes. My heart started racing. David didn't own a Toyota Camry. I asked Carlos if he remembered anything specific about David or the car he drove. Carlos said that David had always been polite and prompt for his appointments, usually scheduling service on Tuesday mornings. The car was registered under a different name, but Carlos couldn't remember what it was. He suggested I speak with Jennifer at the service desk, who handled all the appointment scheduling and customer records. Jennifer was a young woman with a professional manner, who clearly took her record-keeping seriously. When I explained that David was my deceased husband, and that I was trying to understand his connection to a Toyota Camry, she offered to search their customer database. She asked me to wait in the customer lounge while she accessed the restricted information. 20 minutes later, Jennifer returned with a printout that changed everything I thought I knew about my husband's secret life. The Toyota Camry was registered under the name Andrea Collins. David was listed as an authorized driver and emergency contact. The service history showed regular maintenance appointments every 6 weeks for the past 8 months. Always scheduled for Tuesday mornings, always paid for with cash. Andrea Collins. A. The initial on the purple keychain suddenly made perfect sense. David had been driving another woman's car, maintaining it, caring for it as if it were his own. The pattern of Tuesday morning trips north of town corresponded exactly with the service appointments at this dealership. David had been living a completely separate life that revolved around a woman named Andrea Collins. Jennifer was able to provide me with the address associated with the vehicle registration. 47 Sunset Drive in Millfield, about 25 miles north of Millbrook Falls. The same direction David had been traveling when the truck driver fell asleep and ended both of their lives on that Tuesday afternoon. I sat in my car in the Toyota dealership parking lot, staring at the address Jennifer had written on a piece of paper. Andrea Collins lived at 47 Sunset Drive in Millfield. David had been driving her car, maintaining it, and apparently visiting her every Tuesday for at least 8 months. The woman who had cried so desperately at David's funeral, the woman who had left before I could speak with her, was probably Andrea Collins. The questions multiplied with each new piece of information. How long had David known Andrea? What was the nature of their relationship? Why had he been so secretive about her existence that he had constructed an elaborate network of lies to hide their connection? And most importantly, what was I going to find when I drove to 47 Sunset Drive and confronted the woman who seemed to know my husband as well as I did? I realized that I had been gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white and my hands were cramping. The rational part of my mind was screaming that I should go home, take care of my daughters, and try to move forward with my life without digging deeper into David's secrets. But the larger part of me, the part that had been a wife for 12 years and thought she knew everything about the man she loved, needed answers. I started the engine and began driving north toward Millfield. It was time to meet Andrea Collins and discover what she could tell me about the husband I apparently never really knew. The drive to Millfield felt longer than 25 miles. Every traffic light seemed to last an eternity. Every curve in the road stretched my nerves tighter. I had rehearsed a dozen different opening lines, but none of them felt adequate for the conversation I was about to have. How do you introduce yourself to a woman who may have been sleeping with your husband? How do you ask someone to explain your own marriage to you? Sunset Drive was a quiet residential street, lined with modest ranch houses and well-maintained lawns. Number 47 was a cream-colored house with dark green shutters and a small front porch decorated with hanging baskets of flowers. A silver Toyota Camry sat in the driveway, and I recognized it immediately as the car David had been maintaining at the dealership. My hands were shaking as I parked across the street and gathered the courage to walk to the front door. Before I could change my mind, I crossed the street and rang the doorbell. I could hear footsteps approaching, and then the door opened to reveal a woman who looked to be in her early 30s with shoulder-length auburn hair and tired eyes. She was wearing jeans and a blue sweater, and there was something familiar about her face that I couldn't quite place. When she saw me standing on her porch, her expression shifted from polite curiosity to something that looked like recognition mixed with panic. "Are you Rachel?" she asked quietly, and my stomach dropped. She knew who I was. She knew my name. Whatever relationship this woman had with David, it had been significant enough that he had talked about me, told her personal details about his life, his wife, his family. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. "And you're Andrea Collins?" She stepped back from the door and gestured for me to come inside. "I've been wondering when you would find me," she said. "I wasn't sure if you ever would, but David always said you were too smart to let things go unexplained." The inside of her house was tastefully decorated but felt lived in and comfortable. Family photos covered the mantelpiece and side tables, and I could see children's toys scattered around the living room. Andrea noticed me looking at the toys and said, "My daughter is at school. She's 7. We sat across from each other in her living room, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I could see that Andrea had been crying recently, probably more than once in the past few weeks. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, and she kept twisting a tissue between her fingers. Finally, I broke the silence. "I found the key to your car in David's pocket. I need to know what kind of relationship you had with my husband." Andrea closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, she looked directly at me with an expression that was both sad and determined. "David wasn't having an affair with me, Rachel. I know that's what you're thinking, but that's not what this was about." "Then what was it about? Why was he driving your car? Why was he lying to me about where he went every Tuesday? Why did you come to his funeral and cry like you had lost someone you loved?" Andrea stood up and walked to a bookshelf near the window. She pulled out a manila folder and returned to her seat, placing the folder on the coffee table between us. "Because I did lose someone I loved. David was helping me with something that could have gotten him fired, maybe even arrested. He was risking everything to help me and my daughter, and I will never forgive myself for the fact that he died trying to protect us." She opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. Insurance forms, medical bills, legal correspondence, and photographs that made my breath catch in my throat. The photos showed a young girl, probably 6 or 7 years old, with severe bruising on her arms and face. The child's eyes were wide with fear, and even in the grainy images I could see that she had been badly hurt. "This is my daughter, Lily," Andrea said, her voice barely above a whisper. "These photos were taken 14 months ago, after her father beat her so badly that she had to be hospitalized. I filed for divorce and got a restraining order, but my ex-husband has connections in the legal system. He's a police detective, and he knows how to work the system to his advantage." I stared at the photographs, feeling sick to my stomach. The little girl in the pictures looked so small and fragile, and the evidence of violence was unmistakable. What does this have to do with David? Andrea pulled out another set of documents. My ex-husband's insurance claim for the injuries he claimed Lily sustained in a playground accident. He filed a claim with Hartley Insurance Group, saying that Lily had fallen from a swing set at a public park and that the city was liable for her medical expenses. He collected $18,000 in damages and used that money to hire a better lawyer for our custody battle. The pieces started falling into place. David was investigating your ex-husband's claim. David was assigned to the case randomly, just routine fraud prevention. But when he interviewed Lily at the hospital, she told him the truth about what really happened. She was too young to understand that she was supposed to lie, too innocent to realize that her father had coached her to blame the playground equipment instead of him. Andrea showed me David's handwritten notes from his investigation. His careful observations about Lily's injuries, his documentation of inconsistencies in the medical reports, his growing suspicion that the playground accident story was fabricated. David knew that if he reported his findings through official channels, my ex-husband would find out and retaliate. Police officers protect each other, and domestic violence cases get buried all the time when one of the abusers wears a badge. So David decided to help you unofficially. He started coming here on his own time, gathering evidence that couldn't be traced back to the insurance company. He helped me document the ongoing abuse, photograph new injuries, record threatening phone calls. He was building a case that would be strong enough to override my ex-husband's connections and get Lily away from him permanently. I looked at the pile of evidence spread across Andrea's coffee table. Dozens of photographs, medical records, witness statements, and audio recordings, all carefully organized and meticulously documented in David's precise handwriting. This represented months of work, countless hours of investigation that David had conducted in secret, risking his career and potentially his safety to protect a woman and child he barely knew. The Tuesday morning visits, I said, understanding finally clicking into place. David was coming here to check on you and Lily, to gather new evidence, to make sure you were safe. Andrea nodded. My ex-husband was supposed to have supervised visitation only, but he would show up here unannounced, trying to intimidate me into dropping the custody case. David gave me his cell phone number and told me to call him immediately if my ex ever threatened us. He would drive up here and wait in his car until my ex left, just to make sure nothing happened. But why use your car for the dealership visits? Why not just drive his own car? Because my ex was having me followed. He hired a private investigator to document my activities and try to prove that I was an unfit mother. David realized that if his car was seen here regularly, my ex would find a way to use it against me in court. So David started using my car when he needed to go places related to the investigation. Oil changes, meetings with attorneys, trips to the courthouse to file paperwork. That way, there was no record of his Honda being connected to our case. The elaborate deception suddenly made perfect sense. David hadn't been having an affair or conducting insurance fraud. He had been protecting a woman and child from an abusive police officer who was using the legal system to continue his pattern of violence and control. Every lie David had told me, every fake work story, every mysterious absence had been designed to shield Andrea and Lily from further harm. The day David died, I said slowly, he was coming here. Andrea's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her face. My ex had called that morning and said he was coming to pick up Lily for an unscheduled visit. He sounded angry, different from usual. I was terrified that he was going to hurt her again, so I called David. He told me to lock the doors, keep Lily inside, and he would be there as soon as possible. I felt tears burning behind my own eyes as I imagined David's final moments. He hadn't been driving to a business meeting or conducting a routine claim investigation. He had been racing to protect a little girl from her abusive father, the same way he would have raced to protect Emma and Sophie if they had been in danger. David saved our lives, Andrea continued. When my ex arrived and saw that I wasn't going to let him take Lily, he became violent. He broke down the front door and started hitting me, screaming that I was going to regret trying to keep his daughter away from him. But then he got a call about a multi-car accident on Interstate 84, a collision involving fatalities that required all available officers to respond to the scene. The irony was crushing. David had died in the accident that called Andrea's ex-husband away from his planned attack. David's death had inadvertently saved Andrea and Lily from what might have been a fatal assault. He never made it here that day, I said. No. And when the news reports came out about the accident, when I realized that David had died trying to get to us, I thought my heart was going to stop. This wonderful, brave man had sacrificed everything to help people he barely knew, and I was never going to be able to thank him or tell him how much it meant to us. Andrea showed me the final document in the folder, a court order dated 3 days after David's funeral. David's investigation was so thorough, his evidence so compelling, that even after he died, it was enough to convince a judge to grant me full custody of Lily and terminate my ex-husband's parental rights. The judge said it was one of the clearest cases of documented abuse he had ever seen, and he commended the unknown investigator who had compiled such a comprehensive record of the violence. Quote, I sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing everything Andrea had told me. My husband hadn't been unfaithful or dishonest in the way I had feared. He had been heroic. He had risked his career, his reputation, and ultimately his life to protect an innocent child from ongoing abuse. Every lie he had told me had been motivated by the desire to shield a woman and child from further harm. Why didn't he tell me? I asked finally. Why didn't he trust me enough to explain what he was doing? Andrea looked uncomfortable, as if she were debating whether to answer my question honestly. David talked about you all the time. He loved you and your daughters more than anything in the world. But he said you were a teacher, someone who had to follow rules and report suspicious situations to authorities. He was afraid that if you knew what he was doing, you would feel obligated to report it through official channels, and that could have gotten Lily killed. The assessment stung because it was probably accurate. As a teacher, I was a mandated reporter, legally required to contact Child Protective Services if I suspected abuse. And Child Protective Services would have been obligated to involve law enforcement, which in this case meant involving Andrea's ex-husband's colleagues and potentially alerting him to the investigation. David had protected me from having to choose between following the law and protecting a child. There's something else, Andrea said hesitantly. Something David asked me to give you if anything ever happened to him. She left the room and returned with a sealed envelope that had my name written on it in David's familiar handwriting. My hands were trembling as I opened it and unfolded the letter inside. My dearest Rachel, the letter began, if you are reading this, it means that something has happened to me and Andrea has decided to trust you with the truth about what I have been doing. I know you must be confused and hurt by the secrets I have kept, and I am sorry for every moment of pain my deceptions have caused you. The letter went on to explain everything Andrea had already told me, but in David's own words and with details that only he could provide. He wrote about the first time he met Lily at the hospital, how her small hand had gripped his finger while she whispered that she was afraid to go home. He described the sleepless nights he had spent worrying about whether Andrea and Lily were safe, the careful research he had done to build an airtight case against an abusive cop who thought he was above the law. I know that what I am doing violates everything I was taught about professional ethics and proper procedures, David had written. But sometimes the system fails the people who need it most, and sometimes good people have to work outside the system to protect the innocent. I could not live with myself if I followed protocol and allowed Lily to continue suffering while bureaucrats shuffled paperwork and her father used his badge to avoid consequences. The letter concluded with words that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. Rachel, you have always been my moral compass, my reminder of what it means to be truly good. I learned from you that real integrity means doing the right thing even when it is difficult, even when it requires sacrifice. If something happens to me, please know that every choice I made was motivated by the love you taught me to feel for people who cannot protect themselves. Take care of our girls, and please help Andrea and Lily find the peace and safety they deserve. You are the strongest, most compassionate person I have ever known, and I trust you to finish what I started. All my love, always and forever, David. I was crying openly now, tears of grief and pride and overwhelming love for the man I had married. David hadn't been perfect, but he had been good. He had seen a child in danger and had risked everything to save her. He had died trying to protect an innocent little girl from the one person who should have loved and protected her above all others. Andrea was crying too, and for the first time since David's death, I didn't feel alone in my grief. This woman understood what I had lost because she had lost it too. Not a lover or a partner, but a protector, a friend, someone who had cared enough to put his own life at risk for the sake of others. What happens now? I asked. Lily and I are moving away from Connecticut. David's evidence was enough to get my ex-husband investigated by Internal Affairs, and he's been suspended pending a full inquiry. But he still has friends on the force, and I don't feel safe staying here. David helped me apply for a job in Oregon, working for a nonprofit that helps victims of domestic violence. We're starting over, somewhere he can never find us. I looked around Andrea's living room, at the photos of her daughter and the evidence of a life that was about to be packed up and moved across the country. I want to help. David would want me to help. What can I do? Andrea smiled through her tears, the first genuine smile I had seen from her since I arrived. David said you would say that. He said you would want to finish what he started, to make sure Lily was safe and happy. She showed me a bank account statement with David's name on it. An account I had never seen before, containing nearly $40,000. David opened this account to help with our moving expenses and legal fees. He said it was money he had saved from overtime pay and small investments. Money he wanted to use to give Lily a fresh start somewhere safe. I stared at the account statement, realizing that David had been planning for contingencies, preparing for the possibility that Andrea and Lily might need to disappear quickly if their situation became too dangerous. Even in his careful planning, he had been thinking ahead, trying to anticipate and prepare for every possible scenario. He never told me about this account, I said. He was going to after the custody case was resolved and Lily was safe. He said you had a right to know about every penny he spent, but he wanted to protect you from being implicated in anything that might be considered interference with a police investigation. The afternoon was growing late, and I knew I needed to get home to Emma and Sophie. But before I left, there was one more thing I needed to see. "Can I meet Lily?" Andrea hesitated. She's been through so much, and she's still adjusting to the idea that her father can't hurt her anymore. She loved David, but she might be confused about who you are and why you're here. I understand, but I think I need to see her, just for a moment. I need to see the little girl my husband died trying to protect. Andrea called the school and arranged for Lily to be picked up early. While we waited, she showed me more of David's notes and photographs, evidence of his methodical approach to building a case that would keep Lily safe permanently. His attention to detail was remarkable, his documentation so thorough that it read like a professional investigation manual. When Lily arrived home, she was exactly what I had expected, and nothing like I had prepared for. She was small for her age, with large brown eyes and her mother's auburn hair pulled back in pigtails. She wore a yellow school dress and carried a backpack decorated with cartoon characters. She looked like any other 7-year-old, except for a wariness in her expression that spoke of experiences no child should have. "Lily," Andrea said gently, "this is Mrs. Martinez. She was married to Mr. David, the man who helped us." Lily looked at me seriously, studying my face with the intensity of someone much older. Finally, she said, "Mr. David talked about you. He said you were a teacher and that you were very smart." "He talked about you too," I replied. "He said you were very brave." Lily smiled shyly. "Mr. David said that brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing, even when you are scared." The wisdom in her words, clearly learned from David during their time together, brought fresh tears to my eyes. This little girl had survived abuse, fear, and uncertainty. But she had also learned lessons about courage and integrity from my husband. In some small way, David's influence would continue to shape her life long after his death. "Mr. David was coming to help us the day he went to heaven," Lily continued. "Mommy said that sometimes angels have to go to heaven before their work is finished, but other angels come to help finish the work." I knelt down to Lily's level and looked into her innocent eyes. "I'm going to help make sure you and your mommy are safe and happy in your new home. That's what Mr. David would want, and that's what I want too." Lily nodded solemnly, then surprised me by stepping forward and wrapping her small arms around my neck in a fierce hug. "Thank you for letting Mr. David help us," she whispered in my ear. As I drove home that evening, my understanding of the past year had been completely transformed. David hadn't been deceiving me out of selfishness or betrayal. He had been protecting me from knowledge that could have compromised his ability to save a child's life. Every lie had been motivated by love. Every secret designed to shield both me and Andrea from the dangerous consequences of his investigation. The woman at the funeral made perfect sense now. Andrea had been grieving the loss of someone who had risked everything to protect her daughter. Her tears had been just as legitimate as mine, her loss just as real. She had loved David not as a woman loves a man, but as a mother loves someone who saves her child's life. I thought about the insurance money, the policies David had taken out without telling me. Now I understood that he had been preparing for the possibility that his unofficial investigation might end badly, that he might face criminal charges or lose his job or worse. He had been trying to ensure that Emma, Sophie, and I would be financially secure even if his efforts to help Andrea and Lily destroyed his career. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made a decision. I was going to help Andrea and Lily start their new life in Oregon. I was going to make sure they had everything they needed to build a safe, happy future far away from the man who had terrorized them. And I was going to tell Emma and Sophie the truth about their father, about the brave and selfless man who had died trying to protect an innocent child. David had been a hero, and my daughters deserved to know that their father had been someone who stood up for people who couldn't protect themselves. They deserved to understand that integrity sometimes requires sacrifice, that doing the right thing isn't always easy or safe, but it's always worth it. I sat in my car for a few more minutes, holding David's letter and thinking about the man I had married. I had thought I knew everything about him, but I had been wrong. I had known the man he was in our daily life, but I hadn't known the depths of his courage and compassion. I hadn't understood how far he was willing to go to protect the innocent, even when it meant risking everything he held dear. Now I knew, and that knowledge changed everything about how I would remember him and how I would move forward with my own life. David had shown me what it meant to put principle above convenience, to choose moral courage over personal safety. He had left me an example to follow and a mission to complete. Tomorrow, I would start making arrangements to help Andrea and Lily relocate to Oregon. I would make sure they had everything they needed for their fresh start. And I would begin the process of healing from grief that was no longer mixed with confusion and suspicion. I finally understood what David had been doing, and I had never been more proud to have been his wife. The week following my visit with Andrea and Lily was filled with careful planning and growing determination. I had promised to help them relocate to Oregon, but I quickly realized that ensuring their safety would require more than just financial assistance. Andrea's ex-husband, Detective Marcus Webb, was still a threat despite his suspension from the police force. According to Andrea, he had made several threatening phone calls since the custody hearing, promising to find them no matter where they tried to hide. I spent hours researching Detective Webb's background, using the same methodical approach David had taught me when I was working on my master's thesis years ago. Public records showed a pattern of complaints against Webb that stretched back nearly a decade. Excessive force allegations, domestic disturbance calls to his previous addresses, and 2 separate internal affairs investigations that had been quietly closed without disciplinary action. David's documentation wasn't the first evidence of Webb's violent tendencies, but it was the most comprehensive and damning. The more I learned about Webb, the more I understood why David had been so secretive about his investigation. Webb had connections throughout the Connecticut State Police, friends in the district attorney's office, and a reputation for retaliating against anyone who crossed him. 3 years earlier, a social worker who had recommended that Webb's visitation rights be supervised had been transferred to a different department after her car was vandalized, and her home address was mysteriously posted on several online forums frequented by criminals. But Webb had made a crucial mistake when he filed the fraudulent insurance claim about Lily's injuries. Insurance fraud was a federal offense when it crossed state lines, and David's evidence was strong enough to interest the FBI's white-collar crime division. I contacted Detective Raymond Walsh, the insurance fraud specialist Officer Santos had recommended, and arranged to meet with him to discuss David's investigation. Detective Walsh was a tall, serious man with graying temples and intelligent eyes that reminded me of David's careful attention to detail. He listened intently as I explained the circumstances of David's death and showed him the evidence David had compiled about Webb's fraudulent claim. Walsh was particularly interested in the audio recordings David had made of his conversations with Lily, where she clearly described being beaten by her father rather than injured in a playground accident. "This is excellent police work," Walsh said, studying David's notes. "Your husband documented everything properly, cross-referenced medical records with witness statements, and established a clear timeline that contradicts Webb's official report. The only problem is that most of this evidence was gathered through unofficial channels, which might make it inadmissible in court." I had anticipated this concern, and I had prepared a response based on my research into similar cases. But the insurance fraud itself is documented through official channels. Webb filed false claims, collected money under false pretenses, and used that money to hire legal representation in a custody case. The evidence of the underlying abuse supports the conclusion that the insurance claim was fraudulent, even if it can't be used directly to prosecute the abuse itself. Detective Walsh nodded approvingly. You've been doing your homework. You're right that we can build a solid fraud case without relying on the more sensitive evidence about the domestic violence. And once we establish that Webb filed false claims, it opens the door to investigate his other activities more thoroughly. We spent 2 hours going through David's documentation, with Detective Walsh asking detailed questions about the timeline of events and the chain of custody for various pieces of evidence. He was particularly impressed by David's careful documentation of Webb's financial records, which showed that the insurance settlement had been deposited into Webb's personal account and then immediately transferred to his attorney's trust account to pay legal fees for the custody battle. This shows clear intent to defraud, Walsh explained. Webb didn't just file a false claim accidentally or due to confusion about what happened. He deliberately fabricated a story about a playground accident, coached his daughter to lie to medical personnel, and then used the settlement money for personal legal expenses related to the custody case. That's textbook insurance fraud with aggravating circumstances. Detective Walsh agreed to open an official investigation into Webb's insurance fraud, but he warned me that the process would take time and that Webb would likely become aware of the investigation before it was complete. Men like Webb don't go down quietly, he said. Once he realizes that his ex-wife has federal investigators looking into his activities, he's going to become desperate and potentially more dangerous. This brought me to the most difficult part of my plan. I needed to confront Webb directly, not to threaten him or put myself in danger, but to deliver a message that would convince him to leave Andrea and Lily alone. I had something Webb didn't know about: the complete record of David's investigation, including audio recordings and photographic evidence that could destroy Webb's career and send him to federal prison. I arranged to meet Webb at a coffee shop in downtown Hartford, choosing a public location with security cameras and plenty of witnesses. I used a burner phone to call him, identifying myself as David's widow and saying that I had information about his case that he needed to hear. Webb initially tried to refuse the meeting, claiming that he didn't know who David was and had never heard of any investigation. But when I mentioned Lily by name and said I had recordings of their conversations, he quickly agreed to meet. Detective Walsh had strongly advised against confronting Webb directly, but he agreed to have plainclothes officers positioned nearby in case the situation became dangerous. I also arranged for Andrea to take Lily to a safe house operated by a domestic violence shelter, ensuring that they would be protected even if Webb tried to retaliate after our meeting. The coffee shop was crowded with the usual mix of business people, college students, and casual patrons. I arrived 30 minutes early and chose a table near the window where I could see the street and the entrance. I had brought a digital recorder, David's complete file on Webb's case, and a letter I had written explaining exactly what would happen if anything happened to me, Andrea, or Lily. Webb arrived exactly on time, and I recognized him immediately from the photographs in David's file. He was a large man with close cropped hair and the kind of presence that suggested he was accustomed to intimidating people. He wore civilian clothes but carried himself with the rigid posture of someone in law enforcement. His eyes swept the coffee shop methodically, clearly checking for threats or surveillance, before he approached my table. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, sitting down across from me without waiting for an invitation. "I understand you wanted to discuss your husband's accident. I'm sorry for your loss, but I'm not sure how I can help you." I studied Webb's face as he spoke, looking for any sign of genuine sympathy or remorse. I saw neither. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something cold and calculating in his eyes that made me understand why Lily had been so afraid of him. This was a man who was accustomed to using fear and intimidation to get what he wanted. "Let's skip the pretense, Detective Webb," I said, placing David's file on the table between us. "I know exactly what my husband was doing before he died, and I know why he was driving to Andrea's house the day of his accident. I have every piece of evidence he compiled about your fraudulent insurance claim, your abuse of your daughter, and your attempts to manipulate the custody system." Webb's expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've never heard of your husband, and I don't appreciate being accused of fraud or abuse by a grieving widow who's obviously been listening to malicious gossip." I opened the file and placed several photographs on the table, images of Lily's injuries that David had carefully documented. Webb glanced at the photos and I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, quickly suppressed. These are medical photographs of your daughter's injuries, taken at Hartford General Hospital 14 months ago. According to your insurance claim, these injuries were caused by a fall from playground equipment. According to your daughter's testimony, they were caused by you beating her with a belt. That's ridiculous, Webb said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. Children make up stories. They say things that aren't true, especially when they're coached by vindictive ex-wives who want to destroy their fathers. I reached into the file and pulled out a small digital recorder, placing it on the table where Webb could see it clearly. This device contains 4 hours of recorded conversations between your daughter and my husband. In these recordings, Lily describes in detail how you beat her, what you said while you were hitting her, and how you threatened to hurt her mother if she told anyone the truth about her injuries. Webb stared at the recorder for several seconds, and I could see him calculating his options. He was clearly trying to decide whether to continue denying everything, attempt to intimidate me into silence, or try to negotiate some kind of agreement. I didn't give him time to settle on a strategy. The FBI is already investigating your insurance fraud, I continued. Detective Raymond Walsh has reviewed my husband's evidence, and he's convinced that you filed false claims and used the settlement money to pay legal fees for your custody battle. That's federal fraud with aggravating circumstances, which carries a minimum sentence of 5 years in federal prison. This got Webb's attention. His carefully controlled expression slipped for a moment, and I saw genuine concern in his eyes. You're bluffing. No federal agent would take a case based on the word of a dead insurance adjuster, and some recordings made without proper authorization. I reached into my purse and pulled out Detective Walsh's business card, placing it next to the recorder. Detective Walsh is expecting a call from you within 48 hours. He wants to discuss your cooperation with the federal investigation in exchange for reduced charges. But that offer is only available if you agree to leave Andrea and Lily alone permanently. Webb picked up the business card and studied it carefully. I could see him recognizing Walsh's name and title, realizing that this wasn't a bluff or an empty threat. The FBI really was investigating him, and the evidence David had compiled was strong enough to support federal charges. What exactly are you proposing? Webb asked, his voice lower now and less aggressive. Andrea and Lily are moving to Oregon to start a new life. You're going to sign a document relinquishing all parental rights and agreeing never to contact them again. In exchange, Detective Walsh will consider your cooperation when he decides what charges to file and what sentence to recommend. I pulled out the legal document I had prepared with the help of an attorney Andrea had consulted. It was a comprehensive agreement that would legally sever Webb's relationship with his daughter and ex-wife, preventing him from ever using his position as Lily's father to threaten or manipulate them. Webb read through the document carefully, and I could see him weighing his options. On one hand, signing the agreement would mean giving up any legal claim to his daughter and admitting that he was willing to abandon his parental rights to avoid prosecution. On the other hand, refusing to sign would likely result in federal charges, a public trial, and the possibility of spending years in prison. And if I don't sign? He asked. Then Detective Walsh proceeds with the full investigation. The FBI files charges for insurance fraud and racketeering, and every piece of evidence my husband compiled gets turned over to Internal Affairs, the State Attorney General, and the media. Your career in law enforcement will be over. You'll spend years in federal prison, and everyone will know exactly what kind of man you really are. I let the implications sink in for a moment before continuing. But if you sign, you serve your time quietly, you start over somewhere far away from Connecticut, and Lily gets to grow up safe and happy without ever having to see you again. That's a better deal than you deserve, but it's the deal I'm offering in memory of my husband. Webb stared at the document for several minutes, clearly struggling with a decision that would define the rest of his life. I could see the anger and frustration in his expression, the fury of a man who was accustomed to controlling situations through intimidation and violence. But I could also see the calculation, the pragmatic assessment of a man who understood that his options were limited. How do I know you won't use this evidence against me even if I sign? he asked. I had anticipated this question, and I had prepared an answer that would appeal to Webb's self-interest. Because I want this to be over. I want Andrea and Lily to be safe, and I want to move on with my own life. If you sign this document and honor its terms, you'll never hear from me again. But if you violate the agreement, if you ever contact Andrea or Lily or try to find them in Oregon, then all bets are off and every piece of evidence gets released immediately. Webb looked around the coffee shop, seeming to notice for the first time how many people were nearby, how many potential witnesses there were to our conversation. I could see him recognizing that this meeting had been carefully planned, that I wasn't acting emotionally or impulsively, but strategically. I need time to think about this, he said finally. You have until tomorrow at noon, I replied. After that, Detective Walsh proceeds with the investigation regardless of whether you cooperate. And Webb? My husband died trying to protect your daughter from you. The least you can do is let her grow up in peace. I gathered up the photographs and documents, leaving only Detective Walsh's business card and a copy of the agreement on the table. As I stood to leave, Webb grabbed my wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, but firmly enough to stop me from walking away. You have no idea what you're interfering with, he said quietly. There are things about this situation that you don't understand, consequences you haven't considered. I looked down at his hand on my wrist, then back up at his face. Let go of me, Detective Webb. We're in a public place with security cameras, and you're already under federal investigation. Assaulting a witness would be remarkably stupid, even for you. Webb released my wrist immediately, but his expression remained threatening. Andrea isn't the innocent victim she's pretending to be. There are things she hasn't told you about our marriage, about why our relationship ended the way it did. Nothing you could tell me would justify beating a 6-year-old child, I replied. Nothing you could say would excuse filing fraudulent insurance claims or using your position as a police officer to intimidate your ex-wife. Whatever problems you and Andrea had as adults, Lily is innocent, and she deserves to be safe. I walked away from the table without looking back, but I could feel Webb's eyes following me until I reached the door. The conversation had gone better than I had hoped, but I knew this wasn't over. Men like Webb didn't surrender easily, and he would likely try to find some way to retaliate or regain control of the situation. That evening, I called Detective Walsh to report on my meeting with Webb. Walsh was concerned that I had confronted Webb directly, but he was pleased that Webb now understood the seriousness of the federal investigation. You've put him in an impossible position, Walsh said. He can either cooperate and take a plea deal, or he can fight the charges and risk spending a decade in federal prison. Most people in his situation choose to cooperate. The next morning, I received a phone call from an attorney representing Webb. The lawyer explained that his client was prepared to sign the agreement relinquishing parental rights, but he wanted certain guarantees about how the federal investigation would proceed. I referred the attorney to Detective Walsh and told him that any negotiations would have to go through official channels. By noon, Webb had signed the document and submitted it to the family court judge who had handled the original custody case. The judge approved the agreement that same afternoon, legally severing Webb's relationship with Lily and granting Andrea full custody without any visitation rights or obligations. Detective Walsh called me that evening to confirm that Webb had also agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for reduced charges. He's going to plead guilty to insurance fraud and conspiracy charges, Walsh explained. He'll serve 18 months in federal prison and pay restitution to the insurance company. When he gets out, he'll be a convicted felon who can never work in law enforcement again. The resolution felt anticlimactic after everything David had sacrificed to build the case against Webb. 18 months in prison seemed inadequate punishment for years of abuse and intimidation. But I knew that the real victory wasn't Webb's sentence, but Lily's freedom. She would never have to see her father again, never have to fear his violence or manipulation, never have to lie to protect him or endure his abuse. 3 days later, I drove to Andrea's house to help her and Lily pack for their move to Oregon. The domestic violence shelter had arranged for a moving company that specialized in helping abused victims relocate safely, using unmarked trucks and providing security during the transition. Andrea had already started her new job remotely, working as a case manager for an organization that helped other domestic violence survivors rebuild their lives. Lily was excited about the move, chattering about her new school and the playground near their apartment complex in Portland. She had packed her favorite toys and books in a small suitcase that she insisted on carrying herself. When she saw me arrive, she ran to give me a hug and asked if I was coming to Oregon too. "I have to stay here with my daughters," I explained. "But we can write letters and talk on the phone, and maybe someday you can come visit us in Connecticut." Lily nodded seriously, then disappeared into her room and returned with a drawing she had made for me. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, with Mrs. Martinez, Lily, and Mr. David, written in careful 7-year-old handwriting beneath each figure. "Mr. David is watching from heaven," Lily explained. "Mommy says that people who go to heaven can still see us and take care of us, even if we can't see them." I hung Lily's drawing on my refrigerator when I got home that evening, next to Emma and Sophie's artwork and the family photos that covered every available surface. For the first time since David's death, the house felt peaceful rather than empty. I had completed the mission David had started, ensured that Lily would grow up safe and free from her father's violence. That night, I sat down at the kitchen table where David used to pay bills and help the girls with homework, and I wrote a letter to my daughters explaining everything that had happened. They were too young to understand all the details, but they were old enough to know that their father had died trying to protect a little girl who was being hurt by someone who should have loved her. I wanted Emma and Sophie to understand that their father had been a hero, not because he had done something dramatic or famous, but because he had seen someone who needed help and had been willing to sacrifice everything to provide that help. I wanted them to know that courage doesn't always look like what we see in movies, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to look away when someone is suffering. The letter took me hours to write, but when I finished, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't experienced since David's death. I had honored his memory by finishing his work, protected the people he had died trying to save, and ensured that his sacrifice had meaning beyond the tragedy of his death. 6 months later, I received a letter from Lily with photos of her new home in Oregon. She was smiling in every picture, surrounded by friends from her new school and toys scattered around a bright, cheerful bedroom. Andrea had included a note explaining that Lily was thriving in their new environment, making friends easily, and showing no signs of the trauma she had endured in Connecticut. "She talks about Mr. David sometimes," Andrea wrote. "She says that angels are strongest when they help other people become angels too. I think she's right about that. David helped you become the kind of person who could finish what he started, and now you're helping us become the kind of people who can help others in similar situations." The letter reminded me that David's influence extended far beyond his death, that the example he had set continued to inspire people to act with courage and compassion. Lily would grow up knowing that there were people in the world who were willing to risk everything to protect the innocent, and someday she might become that kind of person herself. Webb served his full sentence in federal prison and was released with minimal fanfare. According to Detective Walsh, he moved to Florida after his release and found work as a security guard at a shopping mall. He had no contact with law enforcement and made no attempt to locate Andrea or Lily. The legal agreement held, and he seemed to have accepted that his former life was permanently behind him. I never saw Webb again after our confrontation in the coffee shop, but I sometimes thought about him and wondered if he ever felt any remorse for what he had done to his daughter. I hoped that his time in prison had given him opportunity to reflect on his actions and perhaps find some path toward redemption, though I suspected that men like Webb rarely changed in any meaningful way. The important thing was that Lily was safe, Andrea had found peace, and David's sacrifice had resulted in a victory for justice and protection of the innocent. That was the legacy I wanted to preserve, the story I wanted Emma and Sophie to inherit about their father. Not the tragedy of his death, but the triumph of his courage and the lasting impact of his moral convictions. 2 years have passed since that confrontation in the Hartford coffee shop, and life has settled into a rhythm I never expected, but have come to cherish deeply. The house on Maple Street still echoes with the sounds of childhood, but now those sounds include laughter that wasn't there during the dark months following David's death. Emma and Sophie have grown into remarkable young women who carry their father's sense of justice and compassion in everything they do. Last spring, Emma started a peer mediation program at Roosevelt High School, helping students resolve conflicts peacefully rather than through punishment or exclusion. When I asked her what inspired the idea, she said simply, "Daddy taught us that the strongest people protect those who can't protect themselves." Sophie has channeled her energy into tutoring younger students who struggle with reading, spending her afternoons helping second graders sound out words and discover the magic of stories. Both girls understand that their father died trying to help someone, and they've chosen to honor his memory by helping others in their own ways. The insurance settlement money that caused me so much confusion during those first terrible weeks has been put to meaningful use. Half of it sits in college funds for Emma and Sophie, ensuring they'll have opportunities to pursue whatever dreams capture their hearts. The other half funds a scholarship program I established at the State University for students who plan to work in social services, law enforcement, or child protection. The David Martinez Memorial Scholarship is awarded annually to students who demonstrate not just academic excellence, but a commitment to protecting vulnerable populations. This year's recipient was a young woman named Sarah Chen, whose essay about witnessing domestic violence in her own childhood moved the selection committee to tears. When I met Sarah at the scholarship ceremony, she reminded me so much of Andrea, that same determination to transform personal pain into protection for others. Sarah wants to become a family court advocate, working within the legal system to ensure that children's voices are heard and their safety prioritized. Detective Walsh has become an unexpected friend, someone who understood from the beginning that David's investigation represented something larger than insurance fraud. He continues to work white-collar crime cases, but he's also become an advocate for training law enforcement officers to recognize signs of domestic violence and handle such cases with appropriate sensitivity. Last year, he invited me to speak at a conference about how civilians can support official investigations while maintaining their own safety. My teaching has taken on new dimensions as well. I still love literature, still find joy in watching teenagers discover the power of words and stories. But now I also teach a unit on moral courage, using real-world examples to help students understand the difference between heroism in fiction and heroism in daily life. We read about ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, individuals who saw injustice and decided to act despite personal risk. The unit includes a project where students research someone in their own community who has made a difference through quiet courage rather than public recognition. Last semester, 3 different students chose to write about David, having learned his story through local newspaper archives and interviews with Detective Walsh. Reading their essays about my husband's investigation was both heartbreaking and healing, seeing his actions through the eyes of young people who understood that real heroism often goes unnoticed and unrewarded. Andrea and Lily have flourished in Oregon beyond anything I could have hoped for them. Andrea's work with the Domestic Violence Organization has expanded into training programs for law enforcement, healthcare workers, and educators. She travels throughout the Pacific Northwest, teaching professionals how to recognize signs of abuse and respond in ways that protect victims rather than endangering them further. Her expertise, born from her own suffering and David's meticulous documentation, has helped countless families escape dangerous situations. Lily is now 9 years old, thriving in school and participating in activities that would have been impossible when she was living in fear. Her latest letters are full of excitement about learning to play piano and joining the youth soccer league. The shy, fearful child I met 2 years ago has transformed into a confident young girl who makes friends easily and approaches new challenges with enthusiasm rather than apprehension. But perhaps most remarkably, Lily has begun asking questions about Mr. David and what he did to help her family. Andrea handles these conversations with grace, explaining in age-appropriate terms that some adults hurt children, but other adults work very hard to stop that from happening. Lily understands that Mr. David was one of the adults who worked to keep her safe, and she's expressed interest in becoming someone who helps children when she grows up. Last Christmas, Andrea called to tell me that Lily had asked if she could write a letter to Mr. David, even though he couldn't write back. Andrea helped her compose a thank you note that they left at a memorial garden in Portland, a quiet place where families remember loved ones who have died. Lily's letter thanked David for helping her and her mother, promised that she was being good and doing well in school, and said that she hoped he was proud of how brave her mother had become. The ripple effects of David's investigation have extended far beyond our immediate circle. Detective Walsh used David's methodology as a training template, showing other investigators how to build comprehensive cases that account for the complex dynamics of domestic abuse. The thoroughness of David's documentation, his careful attention to preserving evidence while protecting victims, has become a model for handling similar cases. 3 other insurance adjusters in Connecticut have contacted me after learning about David's work, seeking advice about suspicious claims that might involve family violence. I've connected them with Detective Walsh and provided copies of David's procedural notes, helping them understand how to investigate potential fraud while prioritizing victim safety. 2 of these investigations have resulted in successful prosecutions, with abusers facing consequences for both their violence and their financial crimes. The legal precedent established by Webb's case has also proven valuable for other prosecutors. The combination of insurance fraud charges with evidence of domestic violence created a template for pursuing abusers who might otherwise escape consequences due to their connections or status. Webb's conviction demonstrated that no one is above the law, regardless of their profession or community standing. I have also been contacted by other wives and families of men who died under mysterious circumstances. Women who suspected their husbands had been involved in activities they didn't understand. Most of these cases turned out to have innocent explanations, but in 2 instances, I was able to help families discover that their loved ones had been conducting informal investigations into corruption or wrongdoing. Like David, these men had kept their activities secret to protect their families from potential retaliation. The grief that once felt overwhelming has transformed into something more manageable, a sadness that coexists with pride and purpose rather than consuming everything in its path. I miss David every day, but I no longer feel lost or confused about who he was or what he stood for. His choices during those final months of his life revealed the depths of his character, his willingness to sacrifice everything for people he barely knew. Emma and Sophie have developed their own relationship with their father's memory, one that emphasizes his courage and compassion rather than focusing on the tragedy of his death. They talk about him regularly, sharing stories with friends about the man who taught them to stand up for others and never look away from suffering. Their friends at school have begun referring to acts of kindness or courage as doing a Mr. Martinez, a phrase that would have made David both embarrassed and deeply proud. Last month, the girls and I visited David's grave on the anniversary of his death, bringing fresh flowers and Lily's latest letter from Oregon. As we stood there together, Sophie asked if I thought Daddy knew about all the good things that had happened because of what he did. I told her that I believed he did, that love and courage create ripples that extend far beyond what we can see or understand. Emma, now 11 and increasingly thoughtful about complex moral questions, asked if I would have supported Daddy's decision to help Andrea and Lily if he had told me about it from the beginning. It was a question I had wrestled with for months, examining my own values and priorities. I told her honestly that I might have been afraid, that I might have tried to convince him to find safer ways to help. But I also told her that I hoped I would have had the courage to support him, to understand that some things are more important than safety or convenience. The purple keychain that started this entire journey now sits in a small frame on my dresser, next to a photo of David with the girls and a letter from Lily thanking him for his help. It serves as a daily reminder that we never fully know the people we love, that everyone carries private struggles and secret acts of kindness that define their character in ways we might never discover. I've learned to find peace with the aspects of David's life that I'll never completely understand. There are probably other people he helped, other small acts of courage and kindness that he never mentioned. The important thing isn't knowing every detail of his actions, but understanding the principles that guided him and trying to live up to the example he set. This fall, I'm taking a sabbatical from teaching to write a book about David's investigation and its aftermath. I want to tell the story of how one person's moral courage can create change that extends far beyond their own life, how ordinary people can choose to become extraordinary through their willingness to help others. The book will include practical information about recognizing domestic violence, supporting victims safely, and working within legal systems to protect vulnerable people. Part of the proceeds from the book will support the scholarship fund, and part will go to Andrea's organization in Oregon to expand their training programs. But mostly I hope the book will inspire other people to pay attention when something doesn't seem right, to trust their instincts when they suspect someone is being hurt, and to find ways to help, even when helping involves personal risk. Detective Webb was released from federal prison 6 months ago and has remained in Florida, apparently making no attempt to locate his former family or interfere with their new life. According to Detective Walsh, Webb has maintained steady employment and shown no signs of returning to his previous pattern of violence and intimidation. Whether this represents genuine change or simply pragmatic acceptance of his circumstances, the important thing is that Andrea and Lily remain safe and free to build their future without fear. The house on Maple Street has become a gathering place for people who work in victim advocacy, law enforcement, and child protection. We host monthly dinners where professionals from different fields can share information and coordinate their efforts to help vulnerable families. These gatherings have led to improved communication between agencies and more effective interventions in cases where children are at risk. Emma and Sophie love these dinners, serving as unofficial hostesses and listening to stories about people who dedicate their careers to helping others. The conversations have reinforced their understanding that their father was part of a larger community of people who choose to stand against injustice, even when doing so requires sacrifice. As I write this, I can hear Sophie practicing piano in the living room, working through a piece she plans to perform at the spring recital. Emma is at the kitchen table, writing an essay about heroes for her English class. The sounds of their busy, happy lives fill the spaces that once felt empty and provide constant reminders that life continues, that love endures, and that hope persists, even after devastating loss. David's death will always be a tragedy, a loss that changed our family forever. But his life, particularly those final months when he chose to risk everything for people who needed protection, has become a source of inspiration that continues to generate positive change in the world. That's the legacy I want Emma and Sophie to inherit, the knowledge that their father's courage lives on in every life that has been improved because of his actions. Tonight I'll call Andrea and Lily in Oregon, continuing a tradition we've maintained since they moved. We'll catch up on daily life, share small victories and challenges, and remind each other that we're part of a chosen family bound together by love, courage, and the memory of a man who showed us what it means to put principles above convenience. When the call ends, I'll tuck Emma and Sophie into their beds, listen to their prayers, and answer their questions about school, friends, and the future. And then I'll sit in the quiet house, surrounded by photos and memories and the gentle presence of a love that transcends death, grateful for the life we've built on the foundation of David's sacrifice. The story that began with confusion and suspicion in a hospital parking lot has become a testament to the power of moral courage and the lasting impact of one person's decision to help others. David's investigation saved Lily's life, protected Andrea's future, and created ripples of positive change that continue to spread outward in ways we're only beginning to understand. Sometimes the most important stories aren't the ones that make headlines or win awards. Sometimes the most important stories are the quiet ones, the private acts of courage that happen when no one is watching, the decisions people make to help others even when helping costs them everything. This is one of those stories, and I'm honored to be part of its continuing chapters. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.